Dems versus the Republicans, Hatfields versus the McCoys. If not for Chris navigating down the aisle and getting the Republicans on board saying, hey, listen, you got to set aside this petty nonsense, do it for our guys. He bridged the gap because that bill would have stalled out in subcommittee if not for Chris bringing us to the Hill. And let me tell you, we wore out some shoe leather on that Hill with him leading the charge. So James the Droger Act, the Officer Safety Act, Chris is unbelievable. And if he actually billed us for how much time I pull out of him, we'd probably be paying him $1 million a year instead of what we're actually paying him, which in terms of bang for the buck, this is our best investment right here. So Chris.
Well, since my words can only serve to sully this introduction I just got, I'm just going to go ahead and say thanks. Have a great conference. We'll see you next time. But seriously, first off, let me go ahead and apologize for my voice. My girl started back to school on Tuesday, came back home sick on Wednesday, of course, and dutifully passed it on to me on Thursday. So if I take a cough break or a water break, you'll know why. But I am grateful to be here for what is my second FLEOA conference. And it goes without saying that a lot has happened on Capitol Hill since I appeared before you in 2011. Unfortunately, most of it hasn't been all that good. But as President Adler just mentioned, we've actually been very successful. We've been successful in forestalling, defeating, or mitigating the effects of some pretty bad legislation, especially when it comes to your all's pay and benefits. And we've also been able to be proactive and be successful in getting legislation introduced and passed by the Congress, such as the Officer Safety Act, which deals with removal cases, such as Chris Deede's case that we heard somebody ask a question about earlier. But just to go briefly, I want to use my time today just to talk about where we are on some of the top priority issues, and also talk about the importance of engaging grassroots members, the rank and file members of FLEOA, in our legislative activities. Now, as you know, on Tuesday, Congress is going to come back from its one-month August recess. As I like to say, recess is not about giving them a vacation. It's about giving us a break from them, and it's often well-deserved. But when they come back, they're going to have a full plate of issues to consider this fall, not the least of which is the situation in Syria and the president's request for authorization to act over there. But there's also going to be several other issues that are going to directly impact FLEOA members. This includes the budget, the Boehner-Obama fight over the debt limit increase, appropriations bills, determining which bills will pass, a continuing resolution for those that don't, sequestration, another round of that, and trying to mitigate the effects of sequestration. All of these and many other issues are going to be front and center this coming fall. And the FLEOA legislative team remains actively engaged, and we continue to work with leaders in the House and Senate to mitigate the effects that these fiscal decisions will have on federal law enforcement. In addition to fighting against bad policy, as I said, we're working proactively on some pro-law enforcement legislation. This includes a fixed tax law that would enable federal law enforcement officers to access their TSP funds without the early withdrawal penalty at age 50. We're also working with Peter King on two pieces of legislation that are actually the brainchild of FLEOA. The first is Representative King's bill from previous Congresses that would increase the locality pay rates for law enforcement officers in certain high cost of living areas. The second bill is actually a new proposal that Representative King will be introducing shortly after Congress returns at FLEOA's request. That bill, which we've dubbed for right now the LEAP Max-Out legislation, would remove law enforcement availability pay from the premium pay caps under federal law. And as you probably know, removing LEAP from the biweekly or annual pay caps means that any amounts received would be fully creditable for pay or retirement purposes. In light of another round of sequestration, we're also working with Senator Roy Blunt on a bill called the Essential Services Act. That bill would require that federal agencies must exempt all essential employees, including law enforcement officers, from a furlough caused by sequestration. And what it does is it gives the agency head the authority to shift budgetary resources around so that they can forestall a furlough. There are a number of other bills that we're actively engaged on. I think if you look at the latest edition of the 1811, the full list is in there. But the one I want to spend the most time on is also the one that was most recently introduced, and that's the Senate's Postal Reform Bill, S. 1486. Now, some of you may be asking, why do we care about postal reform? But as you may recall, last Congress we were engaged in a very heated lobbying effort over some provisions that Senator Susan Collins had introduced that would have fundamentally altered the Federal Employees Compensation Act for disabled federal law enforcement officers. Just to be clear, this had nothing to do with the United States Postal Service, its finances, or its future. And it would have, and frankly, I don't think we would have been engaged were it not for this FECA language. But the FECA provisions of her bill were an attempt to move disabled federal law enforcement officers off the FECA rolls and into the federal retirement system once they reach retirement age. And it did this by arbitrarily cutting their disability benefits from either 66 2/3% of pay or 75% of pay if they had dependents, down to a flat level of 50%. As I said, we engaged in a heated lobbying battle for the better part of a year to try and remove the FECA-related provisions because of the negative impact that this would have had. And although we successfully prevented the bill from being passed by the last Congress, it's back again for another round in 2013. Just before Congress adjourned for the August recess, Senators Carper and Tom Coburn from Oklahoma reintroduced the bill with the exact same FECA language as last year. Obviously, this proposal raises a number of questions and concerns for us, both because of the benefit cuts, but also because it does nothing to address the unique needs of law enforcement, the unique nature of law enforcement disabling injuries, or, frankly, the unique needs of disabled federal law enforcement officers. Now, to be clear, we don't oppose reform of the Federal Employees Compensation Act. And, before I came on board, FLEOA was actually very successful in working on some administrative changes to actually improve the program for federal law enforcement. And we've brought that same spirit of cooperation and work to our efforts with this legislation. We've actually proposed some very positive reforms that don't involve pulling the standard of living rug out from disabled federal law enforcement officers who are least able to afford it. This includes strengthening the anti-fraud and program integrity provisions of the OIG's office, the creation of a new division at OWCP to handle disabled law enforcement claims exclusively, as well as allowing law enforcement officers to stay with their agency in a continuation of pay status for up to a year after suffering a disabling injury. Now, this is a top priority issue for FLEOA, and it's one that we've actively been engaged on already just over the August recess. Just 2 weeks ago, for example, President Adler was in D.C., and we met with just about every single member of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to stress our objections over this legislation. As of today, we expect that there'll be 1 to 2 hearings in September, and that the committee will move to mark up the bill sometime around the middle of October. Now, we will, of course, be very engaged on this issue, but to be clear, it's going to be a challenge. It's a challenge because, while we're focused on one title of the bill, we're focused on Title V, the Federal Employees Compensation Act, there's 8 other titles of this bill that deal with the Postal Service. And most members of Congress are concerned about issues such as whether they're going to move from 6 to 5-day delivery, how many postal facilities are going to be closed, how many jobs are going to be lost, and other strictly postal-related matters. As such, this is just the type of legislation that highlights the need for engagement by FLEOA's state chapters, its member agencies, and even its rank-and-file members. Now, I'm speaking, of course, about grassroots advocacy, and I know that many of you are actively involved with legislative advocacy, and your efforts to communicate your concerns to your members of Congress are greatly appreciated. As I said, excuse me. Now, as you know, every legislative column in the 1811 closes with a request, and that is to please take the time to call your members of Congress to ask them to support legislation that you care about, and to watch FLEOA's website to find out which bills FLEOA is working on. But it also concludes with an advisory, and that is your calls and letters make all the difference between success and failure. Why? That's because while FLEOA carries a tremendous amount of weight in D.C., both because of the stature of the organization, as well as the relationships that we've been able to cultivate over the years, an effective grassroots lobbying effort can mean the difference between victory and defeat on FLEOA's legislative priorities. Now, frankly, taking fundraising out of the picture, there's probably no stronger bond that exists in D.C. than the one that exists between a member of Congress and his constituents. And for some politicians, it's probably stronger than the bond that they have with their own mother. Now, although we may go in and we may present the best argument, that can very easily be outweighed if there's one FLEOA voice asking them to vote one way and 50 from the folks back home asking them to vote another. Now, the 2007 immigration bill, that's a prime example of the power of grassroots advocacy. That was also the last time that Congress attempted comprehensive reform of the immigration laws. And as you may recall, that bill went down in a stunning defeat, mainly because of the level of opposition that the groups opposed to the bill were able to generate. And at one point, they were so successful at ginning up their grassroots that they generated enough calls to shut down the Capitol switchboard for the better part of a day. But it's not just phone calls. Emails, letters, personal visits when they're back home, all of this makes a huge difference in galvanizing support for FLEOA's positions on key legislation. Effective grassroots is about building relationships with a purpose, and that purpose is influence. It's about building on the success of the Legislative Committee's efforts to ensure year-round lobbying of senators and representatives, and to solidify the relationships that may begin with a face-to-face meeting between President Adler and a member of Congress in D.C., or between you and your representatives back home. It's also about communicating, and communicating the information that you receive from FLEOA's about FLEOA's legislative activities as widely as possible, so that we can generate the phone calls and letters from rank and file members that are going to make the difference. This involves more FLEOA members in our legislative activities, as well as in the legislative process, and it makes them more knowledgeable about what we're trying to do in Washington, D.C. But in the end, grassroots advocacy strengthens our ability to target legislators, to get them to take specific actions with respect to our top priorities and other legislation that we're lobbying for and against. And so I hope that if there are members who are not clearly engaged or not currently engaged in legislative advocacy, that you will help them become involved and help us make the voice of federal law enforcement officers in D.C. just that much stronger. Thank you all very much. Be pleased to answer any questions.